Assalamu alaikum, Shehzad Sahab and everyone. I am Bushra Aziz and I'll be covering for Shoke Warif Sahab today. Shehzad Sahab, please start your class. I'm going to make you the presenter.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear participants, welcome to this session of Islam Study Circle. I hope you are being able to see the screen that I'm sharing with you. So, the Quranic verse that we're going to discuss today is a very important verse, and the more important it is, I'm afraid, the more it has been neglected in its study, and somehow it has been overlooked by our political scientists and by scholars who actually have presented the political theory of Islam. This is a very, very fundamental verse vis-a-vis the political theory of Islam, and I would just read out this verse before you first, and then its simple translation, and then a small note regarding this verse. So the verse says, وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ. And the translation of this verse reads, and their system is based on their consultation. So you can see that this verse actually has a very key role in spelling out the political principles of a state which is based on Islamic principles. And it says that their system of politics, or whatever system that they carve out for them, for their collectivity, is based on their consultation. In other words, the system which has to come into being has to come into being through their consultation. It has to remain in power as far as it enjoys the consultation or the majority of the people who are consulted. And of course, if this is not the case, and if they no longer enjoy the majority of the people who actually voted them into power, then they shall no longer have the right to remain in power. So, in other words, democracy is a relatively different term, or maybe a term which uses some of the other connotations as well. But as far as this particular aspect is concerned, in which the people are elected through the consultation of other people, people are voted to power through the consultation of other people, it is absolutely the same as what Islam envisages. And when it says Amruhum Shura Bainahum, it actually means that their system has to be based on consultation, which means that each and every person who can cast a vote should be consulted. And after that, of course, if there is a majority mandate for someone or some party, then that party has the right to rule. So you can clearly see that the Quran has given us this mandate, and the system of democracy that we are generally practicing in first world countries and in second world countries as well is exactly in line with what Islam tells us. And of course, on our own note, on the other hand, we can see that our Muslim scholars generally do not spell out this verse or highlight this verse when they speak of democracy. And on the contrary, there is a fair amount of confusion amongst our scholars and our people who reflect on these political issues as to what exactly is the system envisaged by Islam. So, is it a theocracy in which, of course, the select scholars are given the authority to rule, as is the case with Iran, one of our neighboring countries? He thinks that because Islam is an ideological religion and it creates an ideological state, so only people who have a strong competence over this ideology should be the ones who should be allowed to rule. On the other hand, there is a large number of, or a large chunk of people and scholars who think that basically it is monarchy which Islam stands for. And for this cite the earliest caliphate, the Khulafai Rashidun, and then we had the Umayyads and the Abbasids, and then the Ottomans. All of them followed suit. And right until 1924, the system of politics that was in force was this monarchy. In fact, it was a dynastic monarchy in which dynasties were ruled, and people or subsequent rulers would often be from amongst the progeny of the ruler in practice. And even today, we find this going on in in the Vatican of Islam, which is termed as the Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabian system of politics is, of course, dynastic politics, and we find monarchy being practiced there. So we have these three models which today exist in Muslim countries. We have the democratic model, which we can find in, for example, Malaysia, Indonesia, and of course, to some extent in Pakistan. And then we have the theocratic model, in which the foremost example is Iran. And then thirdly, we have this monarchic model, in which the foremost example is Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, if there is such variation in this, then the question arises, and it often confuses students of politics, that which exactly is the system which Islam stands for, and what, or is it gives leverage to all these three systems, or is it that we can make our own system as far as politics are concerned? And then there's this fourth notion also, which although has never found any weight amongst Muslim scholars, but then again, secularism or the separation of religion from state has been another notion, and we can find in yesteryears Mustafa Kemal in Turkey, one of the very vocal proponents of secularism. So the question is that does Islam promote a theocracy, or does it promote a democracy, or dynastic monarchy, or secularism? So if we read through this Quranic verse, وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ, it is pretty clear that Islam actually stands for democracy. And although its own term could be shura'iyat, or a system of shura, but it is nothing other than what democracy stands for. In other words, just as in democracy, you find the will of the people as to who they would vote for when they would like something to be someone to be an authority. It's exactly the same here. And as far as this parliamentary democracy and presidential democracy debate is concerned, Islam has no concern about it as long as the democratic values are upheld. So it could be a presidential system, it could be a parliamentary system. Either of them are fine, keeping in view the situation, the scenario, and the traditions of a society. But it has to be based on consultation. It cannot be a dictatorship. It cannot be a monarchy. And also, it cannot be a theocracy in which only scholars are given this latitude or this prerogative to rule. And another thing which is very important here is that the verse says, Amruhum Shura Bainahum, which means that their system of governance is based on their consultation. And the word bainahum, which means there, between, among them, it does not qualify whether these people have to be educated enough, or, for example, they have to have a certain degree, or they have to conform certain standards, which, like, for example, in Pakistan, we have this famous debate of Articles 62 and 63 of the Constitution, in which the candidates must uphold to certain moral values. The Quran has not spelled out any of these conditions. It says that whatever Muslims are, however they are, of course, they have to be of enough age, of mature age to know right from wrong. But other than that, there is no restriction. It does not say that the candidate has to be a holder of a degree, or a person who votes has to have a certain quality, or a certain mandate, or a certain degree. It does not say so. It says that as far as this system is concerned, it is based on their consultation. And if you have to improve the system, then instead of putting on these conditions of degree holders, you have to improve the lot of the voters. So this is how Islam puts forth its principles. And as I said in my in very earlier on, that this is one of the most neglected verses of the Quran. And I do wish that this is discussed more and more and presented more and more, because this actually, viewers, is the very, very fundamental and primary verse regarding Islamic politics. And it tells us that no one has the authority to assume leadership. It does not. No one has the authority to. Excuse me for that. So no one has the authority to forcibly take up the reins of government and start ruling. In all these cases, it would be considered as usurpation of power. The only thing which has to be understood is that it is out of the masses, whoever they think that they support in majority, then they should hold power. And then again, as I said, that as long as they enjoy the support of the majority, this will continue. And if they do not enjoy this support, then of course the ruling militia or the ruling government would again be subjected to a fresh mandate. So this is as far as this Quranic verse is concerned. We have to understand the fact that the Islamic political system is based on consultation. It is a shura system, and amongst existing systems, it is exactly the same as what democracy or a democratic system stands for. Let us now move on to the next part of our session, and that is Hadith of the day. And the Hadith that we're going to study today is taken from the Al-Jami al-Sahih of Imam Bukhari. It is a very, very important Hadith, and let me read out its text before you. It says, "An Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma قال أخذ رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عليه وسلم بمنكبي فقال كن في الدنيا كأنك غريب أو عابر السبيل." So Abdullah ibn Umar, of course, he is the son of the celebrated companion Umar ibn al-Khattab. So he says that Abdullah ibn Umar says that God's messenger held my shoulder and said, "Live in this world as a stranger or as a traveler." So these words are
सॉरी टू इंटरप्ट शहजाद साहब, आपकी आवाज नहीं आ रही है. या आई थिंक आप ही के पास से कुछ प्रॉब्लम है, क्योंकि सब लोग मुझे मैसेज कर रहे हैं कि आवाज नहीं आ रही है. नहीं, अभी भी नहीं आ रही है. Unmute. Yes.
hello. Can you hear me now?
जी हाँ, अभी आ रही है आवाज शहजाद साहब. थैंक यू सो मच.
Okay. Should I repeat something or should we go on?
आई थिंक यू शुड रिपीट. 1-2 मिनट पहले जो आपने कहा था, आप रिपीट करें.
Okay. Okay. So we were discussing this hadith of the Quran of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and as I said that one should not construe that this hadith actually relates to ascetic tendencies, or it tells us to forsake this world. The words might induce us to believe so because the words say, live in this world as a stranger does or as a traveler. We know that strangers and travelers both never make permanent residence at a place. But you need to understand that this particular verse has been, or this particular hadith has a particular background, and that is that people who start declaring this world or behaving in this world as if it was their ultimate destination, as if it was the real place, and they think that they don't have to go any place after this, and life after that has no significance to them. It is they who are being cautioned and prodded in this hadith. They are being told that don't think that you are going to stay here forever. If you indulge in this world too much, if you think that everything that you have has to happen in this world and you must, and all your interests revolve around this world, and you give preference to this world over the hereafter, then these are the people who are cautioned and prodded in this hadith. So this hadith is not to be taken in an absolute sense, as if it is saying that we should give up the pleasures of this world, as if we should not indulge in this world, as if we should not enjoy this world. It's not at all saying that. What it is saying is that what we should do is that this should not be done at the expense of the hereafter. And the Quran has at one place said, "Wal tu'sirun al-hayat ad-dunya." It is you people who give more preference to this world. So it is this preference that is being talked about, and it is this preference in the background of which it is being said to us that don't give this world as much preference or ultimate preference as you would do in making it hold more weight than the hereafter. So the Prophet is actually cautioning and prodding us and telling us that you should live in this world as if you live as if a stranger lives someplace, or as a traveler lives someplace, because neither a stranger nor a traveler makes any place his or her permanent residence. And he is always on the move. He's always thinking that he is to move on in life. So it's like a comparison which the Prophet has given us, that like a stranger, like a traveler who is always on the move, who's going forward in life, you too must think that this is a temporary life. You're going forward. You have a different destination. A traveler always has a destination. His destination is never the journey that he's undertaking. So the Prophet is actually trying to tell us here that always think of the real destination. When you're traveling, you will stay at your temporary destinations. You will be staying at many places, but then these are all temporary and transient destinations. There is this ultimate destination which you are going to go, and you must always think of that destination. So this is what the Prophet is telling us, and as I said, it is not declaring that we have to give up the pleasure of our life totally. No, but what it is saying is that we must not give so much preference to this life and start indulging so much in this life that we tend to forget that we have an ultimate destination. We have a place that we have to land finally and face the Almighty and be answerable to the right and wrong that we did in this world. So this brings us to the end of the second part as well, the hadith that we have just discussed. This, of course, belongs to the Al-Jami Sahih of Imam Bukhari. Let's now move on to the third part of this segment, and that is Bible verse of the day. And the verse that I've actually selected is from among the Psalms of David, the Prophet David. And the Psalms of the Prophet David, as you know, there are a collection of hymns and a very motivating collection of songs which actually implore the Almighty. And the one that I've selected today is Psalm 27 and its very first verse. So it reads, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Who is then a cause of fear to me? The Lord is the strength of my life. Who is a danger to me?" So basically, viewers, you can see that this Bible verse actually tells us that our real strength, our real support is the Almighty. All other supports, all other strengths, all other things that we can fall back upon, they're all temporary. If we have any support, if we have any person on whom we can fall back upon, any being on whom we can fall back upon, it is the Almighty. And as I have been pointing this out, that we confide our worries, we confide our problems, we discuss so many of our inner feelings with so many of our friends, with our very close confidants. But we know that there are certain things that we cannot even discuss with them. We cannot even bring it up with them because of their nature. But lo, we know that God is, we can discuss those things with God. We can confide with God. He already knows what we have in our minds, in our hearts, and our thoughts. And hence, this is what the Almighty actually is trying or conveying to us through through His prophets, that if you have to hold on to someone, if you have to put your hope or you pin your hopes in someone, it is God. It is God who is the ultimate support. All other supports are temporary. They die away, they pass away, they are all transient. Even very close, very, very close relatives, for example, our father, our mother, or our siblings, or our children, someone, or our friends who might be very close to us, they too leave us one day. They go away, they either pass away, or at times they are physically, they become far away from us, and it's not always possible to be very close to them. But the only being on whom we can fully rely is God. And God is the greatest support that we have. And the Quran actually says that the biggest thing that a person needs while leading this life in this world is patience, is steadfastness, is resolve. And the Quran says, "Wama sabruka illa billah." The only thing which gives you patience, the only thing which gives a person this resolve, is this this connection with God. This God connection that we often speak of is the means of strength, is the means of patience, is the means of giving us comfort. And hence, we need to understand that it is only the support of the Almighty that we must fall back upon. We have to think that God is our greatest friend. The Quran has actually said, Allahu waliyullazina amanu. So God is a friend. He's a friend to those who are believers, to the believers. So, and why has it said so? Because the biggest well-wisher of our own selves is the Almighty. He never wishes ill for us. He's always there for us. Even if He puts us through some bother, also through some test, there is some uh, hikmah, there's some wisdom behind it, and that wisdom is always in our own well-being. At times, we might not be able to understand that wisdom, but ultimately, in hindsight, whenever we look back, we find that the Almighty meant well for us, and it was only we who thought that He's being cruel to us or He's being harsh to us. The fact of the matter is that He never intends this harshness, unless, of course, there is this element of being punished by Him because of certain of our misdeeds. Other than that, at times He passes us or makes us pass through various trials and tests so that we become more closer to us, so that we are given the opportunity to show this patience and reap more reward. And similarly, He also wants us some of our qualities, which are at times uh, hidden and latent in ourselves. And only then that when we pass through a test, only when we pass through a trial, that those qualities, those latent abilities, they come to the surface and they give us more strength. So I always think then when we are told that God is our strength, God gives us more strength, I think the biggest means of God giving us strength is that when we pass through these trials, when we pass through these tribulations, we become closer to Him. Our latent abilities are sharpened, they come to the surface, they actually become more systematic. And this is how we feel inner strength. So, if you want to have this inner strength, don't think that this inner strength is going to be with you in normal circumstances. In normal circumstances, our normal abilities and qualities are with us. But when these circumstances become rough and tough and they really push us hard, that is the time that we fall heavily on the Almighty. We come closer to Him. And the more we come closer to Him, the stronger this God connection becomes, the stronger this linkage with Him becomes. And therefore, that is the reason why the Almighty says that if you fear me, you don't have to fear anyone. There is no cause of fearing anyone if the person only fears God, because if God is the person to whom we all have to ultimately turn to whom we have to give an account and be answerable to, then only He needs to be feared. The rest are all other people who, like us, have to give this account, who have to be held answerable before God, and they too need uh, our own comfort and our own sympathy. So the only thing that we need is we have to find strength through God, We have to find courage through God. We must not fear anyone but God. And if we do that, we'll find ourselves to be energized. We'll find ourselves to be individuals who have that power of faith, that strength of faith, which can literally move mountains, which can literally move mountains. Because the strength of faith is should not be taken as tantamount to physical strength. No, it's a strength which has no other parallel. And if you can find the strength in your own self, you'll find that literally you are a person who might be frail, who might be weak in your physique, but as far as your ideology is concerned, as far as your passion is concerned, as far as your stance is concerned, the strongest and the most tempestuous of winds cannot waver you and cannot make you falter. So, viewers, we come to an end to this first segment. As you can see, that we have been discussing a verse of the Quran, we have been discussing hadiths of the Prophet, and we have been discussing Bible verse. So, if you have any questions, it will be the right time now to ask. Otherwise, we might move on next to the next segment of this session.
शहजाद साहब, आई थिंक राफिया साहिबा को चाहिए, कुछ क्वेश्चन है
Okay.
अनम्यूट है.
Go ahead.
Alaikum Shehzad Sahab. My question is, every week you do mention a hadith. I would like to know is that how do we know that the hadiths are all authentic? Because what I understand that some of the hadiths are weak. So which is the way of being able to differentiate between the authentic or the weak hadiths? Could you guide me, please?
So the question that you've asked is a rather a technical question. Scholars of hadith have actually put forth tools of historical criticism, which critically evaluate a hadith, and then it is they who actually have given us these whole compendiums and these whole you can say anthologies of ahadith. So they have researched them out, but because of the fact that all these researches are human endeavors, and hence there can be some flaws in them. So therefore, the fact that an ordinary student of hadith is not equipped enough generally so as to judge a hadith directly. But what he or she can do is that if he or she is a student of the Quran, immediately as soon as he or she reads a hadith and he or she thinks that there is something which might not be in consonance with the Quran, so that is the first cause of alarm. It should ring a bell in your minds, and therefore that is the way that in that particular area you need to do some more research. For example, if you read a hadith and you find that this is something which is not making sense to you, then you should go to various scholars and discuss that hadith with them. Or in general, scholars have already made the point in discussing these ahadiths, in writing regarding these ahadiths, and you'll find the answers already there. But the bottom line is that it is best to rely on some scholarly research while discussing, while reading a compendium of hadith or an anthology of hadith. And even in that anthology, if you think that there is something which is not making sense to you, then you can discuss that particular hadith with a scholar. Other than that, as I said, that there are certain standards of hadith criticism which have been used by various scholars. For example, Imam Bukhari, one of the foremost muhaddisun or hadith scholars of our times, of course yester times, but he's the classical hadith scholar. He actually applied those tools of criticism to several hundred thousand narratives and came up with about 7,000 of them, which he jotted down in his Al-Jami al-Sahih. And similar is the case with Imam Muslim. But as I said, that since this is a human endeavor and there can always be some fault in it, or it could be improved, hence whenever you read a selection of a hadith, or whenever you come across a narrative which to you does not make sense, or do you think that it is against the Quran or your own common sense, then you must research more into it. And by the way, at Al-Mawrid, we have actually tried to make some of these selections as well. We have a Urdu selection of ahadith, and we have a selection of ahadith in English as well. which are available, I think, on the internet. If not, you can find out from our bookshop. So they have been made available specifically for this purpose, so that if you want to skim through the ahadith, then instead of going uh, through the details of finding out whether a hadith is correct or not, you can rely on the research of some of the scholars of Al-Mawrid, and then even then, it does not mean that you are actually ultimately relying on them. What it means is that it's basically their research, what they found to be in conformity with the Quran, but even that can be challenged.
So basically, I understand the hadith has to be in line with the Quran.
Right. It has to be in line with the Quran, not only with the Quran, it has to be in line with it cannot be against the precepts of common sense as well. So it cannot be against historical principles, it cannot be against established facts. So, and once the Prophet did say a very, very important thing in this regard, and he said that if someone says something on my behalf, and when you listen to that thing, you start feeling as if it is something which I'm not comfortable with. Your hair starts to rise on its end, then be assured that I would not have said such thing, because whatever I say is so close to human nature that whenever someone hears what I tell them, he or she thinks that this is the call of the voice of their own of their human nature. So this is one of the standards which the Prophet himself has given. But other than that, as I said, this is something which we should improve upon every now and then, whenever we read a narrative, and we think that it does not satisfy our intellect, then we should go into more research. But as I said, you have to rely on the researches of current scholars. And again, no research is final. You have to be critical, and you have to be separate as well, so that when you find after your critical evaluation that there are some ahadiths which are not making sense to you, you have all the right to seek opinions of other scholars on that particular hadith.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shehzad sahab. That was very beautifully explained. I have a question myself about Shura Bainahum. My question was, when it is like my question is basically, I wanted to ask that during the first 200 years or the first 100 years when we had Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and we had the Amirul Mu'mineen. So was there a time or was there an instance where the Shura went against the leader?
You see, as far as the Shura is concerned, we know that it was only in the first 25 or 30 years when the system was in practice, which is the rightly guided caliphate, or the Khulafa Rashidun. After that, as soon as the Umayyads came into power, and then we know that right after Hazrat Ali, when Amir Muawiyah nominated his son as the next caliph, it is from there that we know that this caliphate actually transformed into a monarchy. But as far as in the first 30 years are concerned, which are the first four caliphs, the Khulafai Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphate, we do have a lot of details about their shuras, the way they were conducted. And Qazi Abu Yusuf, or Imam Abu Yusuf, in his Kitab al-Kharaj, a very famous document of the second century, also been translated into English and into other languages. You can go through it, and it will give you a lot of details regarding the various shura sessions which were conducted. And we know that there were differences of opinion, and we know at times that Umar Anhu held an opinion and the majority did not accept it. And the biggest example that I can give in this regard is that in all such cases, the elected caliph himself enjoyed the majority of the leaders of those times. The person who came into power, for example, Abu Bakr, Umar, Osman, all of them belonged to the majority party, which was the Quraysh. And amongst them also, unless they enjoyed the majority, the vote of the majority, they were never elected because of some person selection. It was because of the fact that the majority had them in favor. So that is the biggest example that comes to my mind, that in this regard, it was the majority which prevailed and individual opinions did not matter.
Thank you so much. Um, right now, I don't see any more questions, so I think we can still proceed with our lesson.
Okay. So let's start off with the final session, the next session, and in which we discuss generally misconception. And the misconception views which I would like to discuss today actually relates to something that we often do on Eid. And since Eid is approaching the Eid al-Azha, so therefore I thought that I'll discuss a very common misconception that relates to Eid and specifically to animal sacrifice. And one of the uh, biggest challenges which is facing animal sacrifice or the ritual of animal sacrifice is that as time is passing along, more and more people think that animal sacrifice should be replaced by charity, should be replaced by other means in which instead of distributing the meat of a goat or an animal like a camel or a cow, or we should actually use the money through which we buy these animals, and we should spend that money on some charitable cause, for example, helping people who are in distress, for example, helping people who who need money vis-a-vis fees, vis-a-vis sickness, any thing in which they are put through a bother. Now, this misconception has arisen because people think that animal sacrifice or the meat which is slaughtered, the animal which is slaughtered, is basically done because the purpose is to distribute meat. And since meat is to be distributed, and that is a means of helping out other people, people think that we can come up with better ways, like, for example, giving them money for their needs. And this sounds very logical also on the face of it, because meat is not always the requirement of every person. There are several people who would not like to eat meat, maybe they would like the money instead so that they could use it for some other purposes. Now, I would like to comment on this mindset and also try to also attempt to actually see what the Quran has actually told us in this regard. And the Quran is very clear in this regard. And what it says, first of all, let me start off with another very basic premise, and that is that first of all, it should be thought that animal sacrifice on Eid day, whether you're sacrificing a goat or a camel or a cow or anything, first of all, you need to understand that it's an optional act of worship. It's not an obligatory act. It is not a mandatory act. It's not a farz the way we see other farais. So first of all, it needs to be understood that it is not a farz, it is not an obligatory act. However, it is highly recommended. However, it is highly recommended because it stands for a certain philosophy. And that philosophy is not what we have generally understood, and that is that, for example, it is the meat of the animal that needs to be distributed, and hence, of course, that meat should be replaced by some other means. No, that's not the case. And here is where I'd like to make this small point in more detail so that we are able to understand, not only understand this, but also communicate this to our next generation. Because you see, I, in my own right, have seen not only people today questioning animal sacrifice and actually literally saying that this is a redundant ritual of worship, but the same question is being asked by our younger generation, and they are not satisfied with the answer which has been given by their elders. So it's all the more important that these elders also understand that why do we sacrifice an animal on Eid. And as I said, that the first thing is that it is an optional act of worship. If you don't do it, you'll not be liable before the Almighty. However, it is a very recommended act. And why is it so? So now I'm going to explain or attempt to explain that. You see, viewers, you need to understand that there are certain things in this world which hold certain symbolic importance. They don't they are not meant per se. For example, to give you an example, look at your flag of your country. It's basically a piece of cloth. It's nothing more than a piece of cloth, but it is much more. In spite of being a piece of cloth, we are attached to that piece of cloth. We are very deeply attached because it symbolizes the unity of our country. So, in other words, there are certain things which are not to be meant per se. They stand for a certain reality. They symbolize a certain reality. And when they symbolize a certain reality, then it is that reality that we must try to understand. In the case of a flag, or for example, your own national anthem, all these things, they have a special significance because they symbolize national unity. They symbolize something more deeper than the anthem itself or the piece of cloth itself. Very similarly, animal sacrifice is also a symbolic thing. It's not to be considered per se. It's not meant that you sacrifice the animal and distribute the meat. No, it's not like that. You see, the biggest thing that we can present to the Almighty is our own life. It's the biggest thing that we can present to the Almighty, because if there is a cause for which we can sacrifice our life by saving other lives, maybe saving by sacrificing ourselves and putting us through this position simply to achieve a greater unity, simply for the cause of justice, for the cause of truth. If we sacrifice our lives for this purpose, there's no bigger an achievement, no bigger an act of piety, an act of virtue. But of course, this does not come every day. So when we sacrifice an animal, we actually pledge to the Almighty that this is a symbolic way showing to you, our Lord, that today we are sacrificing this animal before you. Tomorrow, if our own life is needed, we'll present it without any hesitation. And as a token of that, we are presenting this animal before you, making this commitment that if we are sacrificing this animal, slaughtering this animal today, then tomorrow, if our own life is required for the cause of truth, for the cause of justice, for the cause of your religion, we will not withhold our own life. So this is what animal sacrifice symbolizes. And hence, you can see that it is not meant for that animal to be, the meat of that animal to be distributed. That's just a byproduct. So when you slaughter an animal, you can use the meat yourself, you can use the meat, you can give it to your friends, you can give it to poor people, you can give it to anyone. But distribution of meat is not the purpose of animal sacrifice per se. As I said, the purpose of animal sacrifice is this symbolic thing, is this symbolic representation that you actually make this pledge to the Almighty that if tomorrow my life is needed, I shall not withhold it. And as a token of my life, this animal that I own today now, I am slaughtering it before you so as to revive my commitment every year before you that whenever my life would be needed to you, Lord Almighty, I'll present it to you. And of course, if we understand this philosophy, this deep significance of animal sacrifice, my dear viewers, our passion to sacrifice an animal is bound to increase if we have this love for the Almighty, if we have the love for the truth and the love for the cause of the truth, love for the cause of justice before us, that if justice and truth requires our life, then this is the rehearsal of giving our lives. If we have this passion in us, it is bound to ignite this flame of sacrificing an animal very punctually. However, as I said, it's not an act of, it's not an obligatory act. It's not something which has been made mandatory. But if we understand the philosophy, it has a very deep significance. And if you understand this, then you can easily see that charity cannot replace animal sacrifice. Animal sacrifice in itself is an act of worship. Charity is another act of worship. Both have their own objectives. Charity is meant to help people. Animal sacrifice is not meant to help people. It's meant to symbolize the fact that you are ready to give up your own life for the cause of the Almighty. Of course, since we sacrifice an animal and we have its meat available, then dispensing with that meat also is something that has to be done. So it's just a byproduct. Meat is just a byproduct. It's not the purpose of animal sacrifice. And that is why the Almighty has said in the Quran, that the blood and the meat of this animal does not reach the Almighty. It is the taqwa, it is this thought in your own self, in your own heart, that you are going to sacrifice this animal with this thing in background, that if tomorrow my own life is needed for the cause of truth, for the cause of justice, for the cause of religion, I will not withhold myself and not give any hesitation in this regard. So this is an important point that I wanted to explain before you, especially in the wake of the Eid al-Adha, which is coming soon, inshallah, maybe in the next 2 weeks. And we must realize that this is the philosophy of animal sacrifice. And if we understand this philosophy, we would perhaps be more committed to this ritual. Although, as I said, that it's not at all obligatory. It's an optional act of worship. And I also know this. We all know this, that it's not always easy to sacrifice animals when you're living in a Western country, because they have their own laws, they have their own rules. Although there are certain areas in which you have this provision, but in many areas this is not possible, and hence people start telephoning their relatives in third world Muslim countries that they should sacrifice animals on their behalf in some other country. Okay, that is also possible. That's a lesser degree of that worship ritual. But again, if someone wants that sacrifice to take place in some other country, that can also happen. But you must realize that it's an optional act of worship, and therefore, if there is something else that he can do with that money, if he has that money for that animal, of course that can be done. But he must not think that the two are interchangeable. The two are not equal. They have different. The charity has a different perspective, as I said, it has a different objective, and animal sacrifice has a totally different perspective. And if we would like to follow the passion and the spirit of animal sacrifice, we need to go through that ritual. We need to make our children understand and pass this torch on to the next generation, so that they are able to understand that if animal sacrifice is to be done, it's not being done for the meat of that animal. It's being done to symbolize the fact that if our life is needed tomorrow for the cause of justice, for the cause of truth, we will be there, and we will not withhold that life for the Almighty. So viewers, this brings us to an end to this session, and I'm now open to questions that you might have.
We have a question from Yasin Saab.
Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Shehzad. My question is, I understand that sacrifice has been part of the deen from day one. So why we have a general concept that it's Sunnat Ibrahimi, and then we do it because Ibrahim alayhis salam sacrificed Ismail, and then it was replaced with a goat, and that the Eid al-Adha symbolizes that. So is that a misunderstanding, or what?
So the institution of sacrifice of an animal always existed. In the times of Abraham, when he made that famous sacrifice, or attempted to make that sacrifice, it actually was given a new dimension. And when we sacrifice an animal on Eid, we not only commemorate that huge act of symbolism which was practiced by Abraham, we also actually tend to revive in us that spirit of sacrifice, of presenting our own life. So it's like saying that one of the manifestations of presenting life to the Almighty was actually displayed by Abraham in his times, and he actually made a platinum example. He gave a platinum example of how one can sacrifice, or one can attempt to even sacrifice one of the greatest possessions one has. So Abraham's sacrifice was actually in line with the same spirit which sacrifice always stood for. So he added this dimension, a huge dimension in it, and that is why when we do the sacrifice on Eid, we say that we commemorate that particular act which Abraham did. So these are not two diverse things; these are the same things. As I said, Abraham did that sacrifice for a particular purpose, and the Almighty actually made that sacrifice to be a symbol of the same sacrifice for which we generally sacrifice animals, and hence the two were united in one. So basically, they are the same. I would say they are two aspects, or two faces of the same coin. And when we sacrifice an animal today, we not only commemorate the sacrifice done by Abraham in his times, but we also symbolize the fact that we ourselves are also ready for that very purpose.
Thank you.
Next question is from Rafia Saga.
Yes, Dr. Shehzad, I have two questions. I would like to know, does Islam permit child marriages. Recently, it was reported that a 41-year-old Malaysian man with 2 wives and 5 kids, one retarded, who he didn't look after, got married to an 11 years old playmate of his daughter. And the ulama said that this was okay. This is one question of mine, and if I can I tell you the second one also? The second question is that recently I read that a 7-year-old girl was raped in Pakistan and killed by her own relatives. Now, during the coming of the prophets, Allah brought a mini qiyamah on the guilty. Now, don't our rulers have to give justice to the people and hang these perpetrators, or will we have to wait for qiyamah for this to happen?
So, your first question relates to child marriage, and let me clearly specify this that Islam or the Quran does not at all uphold child marriage. There are two basic arguments which our clergy generally presents in favor of child marriage, and both of them, unfortunately, are flawed arguments. We've written in detail on both these arguments. If you want some detail or some, we also made video clips on that. So I'll just spell out these in summary, and then you can look up those video clips or the writings that we have on that subject. The first argument that these scholars give is the age of Aisha radiallahu anha, and they think that the Prophet married her when she was 6 or 9 years old, and hence if he married Aisha at this young age, then of course this is something which other people can also do. But we have made this very clear several times. I've discussed this misconception in one of my earlier classes also. You can, as I said, look up the details. So this is the first argument which we have actually refuted. And the second argument is a verse of the Quran from Surah Talaq, which again has been wrongly translated, and hence that translation has led them to believe that underage children or underage girls can be married. So you can look up both these refutations at their respective places. If you would like, I can send you the links. But as I said, these are the basic arguments that they offer, and in our humble understanding, both these arguments are flawed.
And my second question, I mentioned my second
Okay.
question.
As far as your second question is concerned, of course, the perpetrators of such a heinous crime, they have to be punished. You don't have to wait for the Almighty, because, as you know, that the Almighty has stipulated certain punishments for the state authorities to carry out, and one of them is rape. So rape is a public offense, and Islam has legislated against rape, the crime of rape, and hence we don't have to wait for the Almighty to pronounce His verdict and punish these perpetrators in thereafter. Just as theft, just as fornication, just as killing someone, they have been specified. Their punishments have been specified in the Quran in very similar terms. The punishment of rape has also been specified, and hence that punishment has to be given. And if you allow me to say, the verses of Surah Maida, which actually spell out these punishments, give us this word which says "an yuqattalu," when a person who perpetrates such a heinous crime, he should be killed in an exemplary way. He could be killed in any exemplary way, so that people are taught a lesson that this is how such people are dealt with or should be dealt with. So I'm afraid that because of the fact that the interpretation of the rape crime or some of the other things that relate to it, like, for example, the law of evidence and how can we prove that a rape has happened or not, there is a severe problem, a severe flaw in the in proving a crime, because of which it seldom happens that perpetrators of rape are punished in countries like Pakistan. Other than that, as I said, as far as the Quran is concerned, this it recognizes it as a very, very heinous crime, and as I said, it tells us that people who are guilty of this crime can be mercilessly killed and mercilessly executed.
But Shehzad Sahab, shouldn't something be done by our ulama in our country to correct this, or let these poor children suffer?
You see, our scholars, as I said, they have their own view, and as I said, the reason that they often uh, give a different stance in this regard is the law of evidence, because they think that they regard the rape to be equivalent as adultery, and hence they think that just as adultery has to be proven through the admission of four witnesses, so we should have four witnesses for a rape crime as well, and unless we have four witnesses, they cannot be punished. So this flawed argument regarding the proof of rape that is really the cause of this problem. Otherwise, as I said, unless we set right this law of evidence, this interpretation of the law of evidence, which our scholars are not very willing to do so, I don't find any hope in this. But other than Pakistan, there are other countries, I think, which have a different view in this regard. But in our own capacity, we have tried our best to convey to the state authorities that this is the wrong interpretation of these Quranic verses. The issue of four witnesses is never brought up by the Quran in cases of rape. In cases of rape, even if a DNA test is sufficient to tell whether the person who is guilty is correctly proven or not, is sufficient. We don't need witnesses in this regard. And this is absolutely wrong to think that adultery and rape have the same means of proving that crime. So, as I said, this is because of this mindset that we are suffering. Otherwise, as far as the Quran is concerned, it is absolutely clear in this regard.
Thank you very much, Shehzad sir. Please do send me the link about the child marriage. Thank you.
Okay.
Shehzad sir, we have no more questions, and if
Okay.
anyone has any, please let me know. We still have like about 5 more minutes. So it's मेरा खुद का एक सवाल है. So
जी.
like India and Pakistan, what happens is for each member of the family, be it a kid or a grown up, we sacrifice one animal. So like, if there are like 10 people in the family, we sacrifice like 10 animals. So it is like, cruelty, killing so many animals. Of course, it's sacrifice. So what do you think about like sacrificing one animal per family or one animal per like community or something like that?
Well, the reason that you come across this is that in India and Pakistan, the Hanafites, or the followers of Imam Abu Hanifa, they are in majority. And since the opinion of the Hanafites is that this is a sunnah muqadda, it's a wajib sunnah on every person, and every person who has a certain capacity, he is liable or she is liable to do animal sacrifice. So this is that their interpretation. Since the Hanafites are in majority both in Pakistan and in India, so therefore you come across this view. So as I said, that if you study the sources, if you go deeper into the sources, you'll find out that it is not at all obligatory, it's not mandatory. And if you start telling people that it's not mandatory, then a balance will automatically be achieved. So maybe just one animal per family. At times when a family cannot even afford a single animal, they can still go, not feel guilty that they've done something or they've left out something. So I think it's like by telling them that this is an optional act of worship. It has great significance. It has, in fact, great symbolic significance, and if you can do it, you must do it, because it's going to revive your faith in the Almighty. It's like a revival with the Almighty. But if you start telling them that it's obligatory, it's not only obligatory, but it's obligatory on every single earning hand of the family, then things start to become more difficult and get out of hand. So I think what you need to tell, or maybe first of all, educate your own self in, is that it's an optional act of worship. As soon as you realize this, I think the extremity which has developed in this regard will automatically get toned down.
Thank you so much. And I think we almost done our class, so gotta say something. Be done.
Okay. So inshallah, we'll see you next Saturday on the same time.
Thank you so much for joining us. Inshallah, we'll see you next week.
Okay. Okay. Khuda Hafiz.
Assalamu alaikum.